everyone, and I hope as we look at the next chapter in Esther, that's chapter 4, verses 1 to 17, that it will help us to prepare for our home groups next week, or indeed our private study of this Old Testament book. It's always good to recap, and maybe all the more necessary given that we're only looking at one chapter per month. So at this point, chapter 4, Esther is King Xerxes' new queen, having won the Persian beauty contest. She's a Jew, we know, but so far her ethnicity has not been revealed to anyone in the palace. Her cousin Mordecai, who's more like a father to Esther than a cousin, has uncovered a plot to kill the king at the end of chapter 2. But in chapter 3 then, the focus is on Haman the Agagite, who has been promoted by Xerxes the king to a position of significance and honour within the royal administration. Now, Haman's a man who doesn't like to be denied the honour that he feels his authority deserves, and so when Mordecai refuses to bow before him, chapter 3 verse 5, Haman is enraged, and out of all proportion to the supposed offence, Haman plans to annihilate the entire Jewish population. It's virtually impossible not to see Satan behind this plot to get rid of the chosen people of God, and indeed to stop the coming of the Messiah long before his miraculous birth in Bethlehem centuries after. However, the royal edict is forthcoming from the easily manipulated Xerxes, and dispatches sent throughout the entire nation to chapter 3 verse 13, destroy, kill and annihilate the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th of the 12th month. And so chapter 4 begins with Mordecai lamenting in sackcloth and ashes. Something awful's about to happen, and Mordecai feels it deeply in his heart. Maybe ponder what might cause you to lament as deeply as this. And I'm not thinking about the mortality of a loved one that you might feel on a personal level, because this goes way beyond that. Are you tuned in to the peril that people are in without the Lord? The danger of eternity without Christ? Because surely that ought to move us deeply, and consequently to cry out to the Lord in lament and intercession. Recognise also here that the entire population are bemused by the king's edict, as the last verse of chapter 3 tells us. But as it has specific reference to the life and death of the Jews, so chapter 4 tells us all the Jews weep and wail and fast. King Xerxes seems oblivious to the plight of an entire people group within his realm, and there's more discernment from the ordinary citizens in the street than the man who occupies the throne of the land. And as you go through the chapter, notice Esther's initial reaction to Mordecai when he courageously laments in public, right up to the king's gate, what's going to happen to the Jews. What does Esther do? Look at verse 4. She sends him clothes. What a strange thing to do. Is she so cut off in the palace from what's happening out there in the real world that she tries to cheer Mordecai up by ordering him a new wardrobe? Or is she hoping that this might appease her cousin and keep her from knowing what she knows she has to do? Either way, Mordecai is absolutely straight with Esther, and he leaves her in no doubt as to what's ahead. Maybe we can learn that sometimes being real is what's needed, and not to soft soap things or paint an artificial version of reality that does no one any good. And what's ahead for Esther is nothing short of courageous, dangerous, and faithful. Now, we're all familiar in today's world with the concept of risk assessments. That is, we plan to do something in which others are involved, And before anything happens, we evaluate the potential hazards and take steps to either remove those hazards completely or minimize them as best we can. Well, if a risk assessment had have been done here, Esther would never have left her room in the palace, for she was risking her life, and in two particular ways. It was, first of all, a risk to go into the king's presence uninvited, even if she was the queen. And bear in mind, this chapter tells us that she hadn't been in the king's presence for quite some time. But it was also a risk for Esther to reveal her identity as a Jew, which she was going to have to do if the king was going to repeal the edict. And the chapter ends without anyone knowing if Esther, when taking this course of action, will actually live or die. But look at her faith in verse 16. She says this, "If I perish, I perish." At the end of thinking it all through and determining what's ahead and encouraging the people to fast with her, she says, "If I perish, I perish." And this isn't fatalism. This is not a kind of que sera, sera, whatever will be, will be. It is an implicit yet wholehearted trust in the Lord that he is in control no matter what happens. Sometimes we don't know the outcome of a particular course of action we might take, where obedience to God's will and God's way trumps the dangers and risks associated with whatever we plan to do. You see, to acknowledge that is not a lack of belief or faith. It's a realistic appraisal of our finite understanding, and we can do that fully committed to the God who knows the end from the beginning. That's what Esther's doing here, and she's a wonderful example to us all in that regard. And notice too that for Esther, there was a time to conceal and a time to reveal her Jewish identity. Remember Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and the way in which there are times when it's right to do one thing and then times when it's right to do the opposite. Mourn and dance, tear down and build up, plant and uproot, scatter and gather. For Esther, there was a time to be silent, but there was also a time to speak, and this was it. And in that classic and precious verse 14 of Esther chapter 4, we read, "And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" Mordecai and Esther both knew that God's plans were for the preservation of his people, and yet they both still had to think and fast and weep and mourn and act at the right time, because in the sovereign plans and purposes of God, they were both his means of accomplishing his will. And you know, sometimes we can get way too philosophical about the sovereignty of God and the freedom of the human will. Well, Esther's a superb example of knowing God's will and determining to act, and both are necessary to do. And finally, to go back to risk assessments and the inherent dangers of obedience and service, do note the parallels that we have in the life and the ministry of the Lord Jesus Christ. Because Jesus was constantly in danger from people who wanted him silenced and who wanted him dead. And knowing not just the likelihood, but the certainty of the cross and of yielding his life, yet still he set his face like flint and went to Jerusalem and went to Calvary's Hill, and he did make the ultimate sacrifice of his life for yours and for my preservation for eternity. "Not my will, but yours," Jesus said, in full obedience to the divine plan, and in a perfect way. So Jesus lived and died and rose triumphant from the grave for you and me and for redemption for the world for such a time as this. So hopefully these few thoughts in chapter 4 will help you to study it and help you to gain much from it. And may the Lord himself be our teacher as next week we turn to his word together.